The history of Jewish settlement within the geographic bounds of future France commences not in the medieval period of royal charters, but deep within the administrative and economic structure of the Roman Empire, specifically the province of Gallia. Epigraphic evidence provides the primary, though often scattered, documentation of these communities, with funerary inscriptions in Latin and sometimes Greek offering the most tangible proof of demographic presence. These fragmented remains suggest that Jewish residents arrived in the region alongside Roman expansion, primarily utilizing the robust commercial arteries established by the imperial system. The earliest known archaeological finds, such as a 3rd century menorah carved into a sarcophagus lid, were discovered in the Rhone Valley, specifically near Narbonne, indicating a concentration of population along this crucial maritime and riverine corridor. This geographical pattern highlights a primary function of these early residents: participation in the extensive trade networks that linked the Mediterranean basin to the Gallic interior. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews? And did they actually deserve it? Literary sources further corroborate the existence of organized Jewish life, as early Christian writings from the 4th and 5th centuries refer to established communities in cities like Lyon and Clermont. These texts, often polemical in nature, nonetheless confirm the institutional continuity of Jewish religious practice, including the maintenance of synagogues and the observance of Sabbath laws within the late imperial urban environment. The legal status of these individuals was generally defined by Roman civil codes pertaining to recognized non-Christian populations, granting a degree of communal autonomy under the authority of the Patriarch of Palestine. During the transitional phase following the collapse of centralized Roman administration, the newly established Germanic kingdoms, particularly the Visigoths in the south, maintained and often reaffirmed the existing Roman legal framework that governed the Jews. This stability facilitated the continued function of Jewish communities as vital intermediaries in the exchange of goods between the Mediterranean and the fragmented successor states of the Western Empire. Just a quick announcement. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. Textile, spice, and slave trades provided the economic foundation for these early settlements, creating centers of wealth in southern locations like Marseille and Arles that were geographically favorable for long-distance commerce. The absence of systematic archaeological layers dedicated solely to Jewish residential districts implies a pattern of integration within the general urban fabric, a characteristic distinguishing the late antique presence from the more segregated enclaves of the later Middle Ages. The initial integration, supported by economic necessity and pre-existing legal status, established the enduring foundation of Jewish life in Gaul that would persist through the Merovingian and Carolingian eras. The cultural assimilation, however, was significant, with Latin becoming the dominant language for all public records and much internal correspondence, evidence of which is preserved in surviving burial stones. The ascent of the Carolingian dynasty in the 8th century introduced a new phase of formalized political management concerning the Jewish populations within the expanding Frankish realm. Charlemagne's reign, commencing in 768 CE, established a centralized imperial authority that superseded the varied and often localized ordinances of the preceding Merovingian period. This consolidation resulted in a unique set of policies aimed at utilizing Jewish communities for the economic and diplomatic benefit of the crown. Crucially, imperial legislation designated the Jews as being under the direct protection of the emperor, fundamentally changing their legal relationship from one governed by local bishops and regional nobles to one anchored in the highest political office. This special status necessitated the appointment of a specific official, the Magister Judiorum, or Master of the Jews, responsible for overseeing their internal affairs, collecting taxes, and acting as a liaison between the communities and the imperial court. The imperial need for reliable, educated merchants with international contacts became a cornerstone of Carolingian policy. Jewish traders, known in contemporary records as the Radhanites, were uniquely positioned to bridge the vast distances of the Carolingian world and the markets of the Islamic East and the Byzantine South. These commercial activities were instrumental in supplying the Frankish aristocracy with essential luxury goods, including high-quality silks, exotic spices, and specialized manufactured items unavailable in Western Europe. This strategic economic function secured their privileged position and shielded them from many of the prohibitive restrictions imposed on other non-Christian groups. Charters granted during this time guaranteed freedom of movement, the right to engage in all forms of commerce, and the freedom from having to submit to judicial oaths considered insulting under Christian law. Evidence from the 9th century, particularly during the reign of Louis the Pious, details this protective relationship through formal writs that granted specific communities the right to hold property, employ Christian servants, a highly regulated practice, and maintain their own judicial apparatus for internal disputes. This systematic approach to regulation ensured that the crown profited from the economic vitality of the Jewish subjects, while providing a controlled environment for their activities. The scholarly life also found stable patronage, enabling Jewish savants to maintain intellectual links with the major academies of the Near East, thereby contributing to the transmission of scientific, medical, and astronomical knowledge into the nascent Carolingian Renaissance. The stability engineered by Charlemagne and his successors represented a high point of legal security and economic integration, contrasting sharply with the demographic pressures and hostile legal changes that would follow the eventual fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire. This institutionalized tolerance, driven by fiscal and geopolitical motivations, created a legacy of stability that lasted until the rise of a new, geographically focused dynastic power in the late 10th century. The establishment of the Capetian monarchy following the election of Hugh Capet in 987 CE inaugurated a protracted and fundamental restructuring of political power in the nascent Kingdom of France. Unlike the preceding era of vast, if fragmented, imperial protection, the new dynasty initially controlled only a modest royal domain centered around Île-de-France. This regionalization of authority directly impacted the status of Jewish populations, dissolving the comprehensive imperial protective system and decentralizing jurisdiction over them. Jewish communities, formerly subjects directly accountable to the emperor, now found themselves increasingly subject to the varying and often capricious regulations of local ecclesiastical and secular lords. This fragmentation exposed them to a multiplicity of localized taxes and economic demands that had been largely absent under the unified administration. The primary legal concept that began to coalesce during this period was the Servitus Judiorum, effectively defining the Jewish body not as free subjects, but as legally subordinate entities belonging to the immediate feudal superior. This transformation marked the conceptual shift toward viewing Jews as the chattel of the monarch's treasury, foreshadowing the later definitive doctrine of servi camera regis, servants of the king's chamber. This evolving status made them highly susceptible to arbitrary levies, known as tallages, or extraordinary taxes, imposed not for defense of the realm, but purely as a means of royal or seigneurial revenue extraction. The lack of a strong central guarantor meant that privileges previously secured by imperial decree were now dependent on renewable grants from less powerful and more acquisitive authorities. Economically, the waning of international commerce along the old Carolingian routes led to a decisive pivot toward localized financial activities. The communities increasingly specialized in small-scale lending to both peasants and impoverished nobles, providing essential credit in an otherwise fiscally rigid, species-scarce environment. This necessary function, while profitable, simultaneously cultivated deep resentment within the Christian population, providing the moral justification for future restrictions. Furthermore, external pressure mounted from the growing political influence of the Church. The councils of the 12th century, such as the Third Lateran Council in 1179, began issuing canon law that formally prohibited Christians from residing with Jews and imposed specific restrictions on commercial interactions, thereby initiating a process of forced social and geographic separation within the urban landscape. This convergence of fiscal vulnerability, localized dependency, and ecclesiastical scrutiny set the stage for the dramatic, unilateral actions that subsequent, stronger Capetian monarchs would take against their Jewish subjects. The foundational premise of their existence had been irrevocably altered from one of tolerated utility to one of conditional dependency on the crown's fluctuating financial needs. The economic specialization of Jewish communities in France during the High Medieval period was intrinsically linked to the spectacular rise of the great Champagne fairs. From the 11th through the 13th centuries, these 6 annual events in towns like Troyes and Provence served as the central pivot for trans-European commerce, connecting producers from Italy and Flanders with consumers across the continent. Jewish merchants played a disproportionately vital role in this expansive economy, acting as multilingual agents and necessary financial conduits. Their geographic mobility and long-established kinship networks, stretching from England to the Rhineland and the Mediterranean littoral, provided the crucial infrastructure required for long-distance trade at a time when political boundaries were fluid and standardized currency systems were lacking. These merchants excelled in the importation of high-value portable commodities such as finished textiles, raw silk, and exotic spices, which were easily transported and commanded significant profit margins. More crucial than the movement of goods, however, was their function as lenders and currency exchangers. The communities were instrumental in the nascent development of documentary credit, utilizing bills of exchange and letters of credit to allow transactions to occur without the constant peril of transporting large quantities of gold or silver across insecure feudal territories. This financial mechanism was indispensable for lubricating the wheels of the fairs and ensuring their functional efficiency. While some Jewish lenders provided capital to finance grand aristocratic projects or military campaigns, the majority of their financial activities were dedicated to meeting the more immediate credit needs of the population. This included short-term loans to peasants needing seed, artisans requiring raw materials, and small-scale traders seeking working capital to participate in the local markets. The interest charged, though often high by modern standards, was a reflection of the inherent risks of lending in a legal and economic environment characterized by uncertainty and the frequent revocation of debts by powerful debtors. The wealth generated through these commercial and financial endeavors provided the fiscal autonomy necessary to sustain their rigorous scholarly institutions and pay the ever-increasing tallages demanded by the Capetian crown and local lords. This established relationship taxable wealth, in exchange for conditional protection, formed the complex and ultimately precarious foundation of the French Jewry's continued existence. The economic specialization of Jewish communities in France during the High Medieval period was intrinsically linked to the spectacular rise of the great Champagne fairs. From the 11th through the 13th centuries, these 6 annual events in towns like Troyes and Provence served as the central pivot for trans-European commerce, connecting producers from Italy and Flanders with consumers across the continent. Jewish merchants played a disproportionately vital role in this expansive economy, acting as multilingual agents and necessary financial conduits. Their geographic mobility and long-established kinship networks, stretching from England to the Rhineland and the Mediterranean littoral, provided the crucial infrastructure required for long-distance trade at a time when political boundaries were fluid and standardized currency systems were lacking. These merchants excelled in the importation of high-value portable commodities such as finished textiles, raw silk, and exotic spices, which were easily transported and commanded significant profit margins. More crucial than the movement of goods, however, was their function as lenders and currency exchangers. The communities were instrumental in the nascent development of documentary credit, utilizing bills of exchange and letters of credit to allow transactions to occur without the constant peril of transporting large quantities of gold or silver across insecure feudal territories. This financial mechanism was indispensable for lubricating the wheels of the fairs and ensuring their functional efficiency. While some Jewish lenders provided capital to finance grand aristocratic projects or military campaigns, the majority of their financial activities were dedicated to meeting the more immediate credit needs of the population. This included short-term loans to peasants needing seed, artisans requiring raw materials, and small-scale traders seeking working capital to participate in the local markets. The interest charged, though often high by contemporary standards, was a reflection of the inherent risks of lending in a legal and economic environment characterized by uncertainty and the frequent revocation of debts by powerful debtors. The wealth generated through these commercial and financial endeavors provided the fiscal autonomy necessary to sustain their rigorous scholarly institutions and pay the ever-increasing tallages demanded by the Capetian crown and local lords. This established relationship, taxable wealth in exchange for conditional protection, formed the complex and ultimately precarious foundation of the French Jewry's continued existence. The proclamation of the First Crusade by Pope Urban II in 1095 CE initiated a violent and unprecedented transformation of the security environment for Jewish communities across Western Europe, particularly in the transit zones leading to the Holy Land. Although the official goal was the liberation of Jerusalem from Muslim control, the fervent, unorganized popular armies unleashed a wave of religious hysteria, whose zeal was quickly redirected closer to home. The systematic violence commenced in the Rhenish heartland, spreading rapidly westward and southward as disorganized bands of knights, impoverished peasants, and local zealots marched, carrying out massacres in major towns such as Mainz, Worms, and Cologne. This catastrophic wave of persecution demonstrated a critical failure of local political and ecclesiastical authorities to enforce the protective rights traditionally afforded to the Jewish population, revealing the inadequacy of royal and episcopal charters in the face of widespread mass religious fervor. The impact of the 1,096 atrocities was not limited to the immediate human cost and physical destruction. It inflicted profound and lasting psychological trauma on the Jewish collective consciousness. Prior to this event, the threat of persecution was generally perceived as a localized, primarily financially motivated extraction. Afterward, it became unequivocally recognized as an existential, faith-based peril. This brutal realization led to a subsequent, necessary shift in communal self-defense strategy, moving away from reliance on fragile secular guarantees toward internal self-help mechanisms and, tragically, collective ritualized self-immolation. Communities frequently chose ritual suicide, or Kiddush Hashem, rather than submit to forced conversion when confronted by the advancing murderous crusader mobs, an agonizing practice documented with chilling regularity by the Hebrew chroniclers of the time. Economically, the events caused substantial demographic dislocations, as surviving families fled regions previously considered geographically secure and redistributed themselves into less exposed urban centers within the royal domain of France. The extensive loss of life and property in the Rhineland significantly disrupted the existing networks of European finance and long-distance trade, forcing surviving Jewish merchants to adapt rapidly to entirely new geographical and unstable political realities. The French crown and various regional magnates initially issued condemnations of the random violence and sought to restore order, often doing so primarily to reassert their own fiscal control over the communities, whose extensive assets were technically viewed as a source of direct royal revenue. Nevertheless, the experience permanently eroded the trust between the Jewish population and their Christian rulers, establishing a precedent of large-scale religious violence that would repeatedly manifest over the next 2 centuries, permanently altering the communal perception of physical security within Christian territories. The architectural morphology of Jewish settlement in high medieval France underwent a distinct transformation, evolving from scattered residency within the Roman urban grid to the formation of the recognizable quarter known as the Jewry. This development was primarily driven not by formal, universal legal mandates for segregation, but by a confluence of economic necessity, practical security concerns, and the gradually intensifying pressures of local Christian hostility. Initially, in the 11th and 12th centuries, the communities gravitated toward the commercial heart of the city, often situated near the primary marketplace or the main thoroughfares that facilitated trading activities. This proximity to the economic nexus was essential for their financial and mercantile vocations. The establishment of the Jewry as a physical district was defined by 2 central institutional components, the synagogue and the communal bathhouse, or mikveh. The presence of these sacred structures determined the geographical nucleus of the quarter, as religious law necessitated that members reside within easy walking distance. The synagogue itself served as the primary nexus of communal governance, encompassing not only religious functions but also judicial courts, educational institutions, and administrative meeting spaces, reflecting the complete autonomy of internal Jewish jurisdiction. The construction techniques of the buildings within these quarters were typically indistinguishable from those of their Christian neighbors, though they often featured a higher concentration of multi-story, densely packed housing due to land scarcity in desirable commercial zones. As social tension increased throughout the 13th century, local initiatives, often spearheaded by municipal or ecclesiastical authorities, began introducing physical barriers to the Jewry. While not universally present, these barriers, such as gates, chains, or strategically blocked side streets, were ostensibly implemented for the security of the Jewish inhabitants and their royal assets, but simultaneously served to physically demarcate the community. This demarcation facilitated the collection of special taxes and streamlined the process of surveillance and eventual seizure of property. However, it is crucial to note that prior to the 16th century, these quarters were rarely, if ever, completely sealed or continuously guarded ghettos. Rather, they represented neighborhoods with a high concentration of Jewish residency, often with Christian neighbors and regular access to the general marketplace. This architectural evolution from integrated residence to concentrated, and occasionally barricaded, districts directly illustrates the deteriorating relationship between the Jewish population and the surrounding society, paving the way for the unilateral destruction of their assets. The proliferation of ritual allegations during the High and Late Middle Ages fundamentally degraded the legal and social status of Jewish communities within France, injecting a theological hostility into communal life that transcended mere financial or economic resentment. The core of these accusations, the so-called blood libel, posited the horrific claim that Jewish individuals ritually murdered Christian children to use their blood for ceremonial purposes, most notably in the preparation of unleavened bread for Passover. This specific malicious invention first gained official traction in England with the case of William of Norwich in the mid-12th century, but quickly migrated across the Channel, finding receptive and fertile ground in the emotionally charged environment of continental Christendom. The systematic dissemination of this falsehood was achieved through the sermons of mendicant friars and the rapidly expanding genre of vernacular literature, securing its place within the popular imagination as an established, though baseless, truth. Unlike earlier forms of persecution that were geographically localized and focused on physical property, the blood libel presented a profound, unanswerable theological charge. It weaponized the central Christian mystery of the crucifixion, transforming the Jew from a theological witness to Christ's passion into an active, malevolent participant in a continuous, secret war against the Christian body. The appearance of a dead child, often found near the Jewish quarter, was sufficient to trigger a chain reaction. Immediate civic unrest, mass arrests of community leaders, and the subsequent use of judicial torture to extract forced confessions of the alleged crime. This systematic application of torture under royal or seigneurial authority ensured that the narrative of ritual murder was legally validated within the courts, creating a perverse legal precedent that justified future violence. The immediate consequences of these allegations were catastrophic, leading directly to waves of mass execution, often culminating in the burning of entire communities at the stake, and the widespread confiscation of communal and individual assets. The Crown benefited directly from the ensuing escheat of wealth, further incentivizing local authorities to pursue the charges. Notable instances, such as the event at Blois in 1171, demonstrated the devastating speed with which such a charge could obliterate a flourishing community, and established a chilling pattern of governmental indifference to basic due process. The blood libel thus provided the Capetian monarchy with a politically and spiritually defensible instrument for extraction and eventual removal, framing persecution not as a financial act, but as a necessary purification of the Christian realm from an imagined existential evil. This systematic theological defamation became an irreversible factor in the total destruction of Franco-Jewish relations. The accession of Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, in 1180 CE marked a pivotal consolidation of royal power that immediately translated into decisive coercive action against the Jewish population. As a young monarch eager to assert fiscal independence from the great barons and fund his nascent state-building agenda, Philip viewed the Jewish community primarily as a vast, immediately extractable financial asset. In 1182, he issued a sweeping edict mandating the expulsion of all Jews from the royal domain, an act demonstrating an unprecedented centralized exercise of fiscal and legal authority over this entire class of subjects. The legal framework supporting this action was simple yet powerful. The assertion of the Crown's ultimate ownership over the persons and property of the Jews, formalized under the developing principle of servi camera regis. The execution of the 1182 decree was highly systematic and revealed the administrative capacity of the burgeoning Capetian bureaucracy. The initial phase involved the physical displacement of the inhabitants, giving them a brief period of 3 months to liquidate personal, portable assets. This was swiftly followed by the more complex process of expropriation. Royal officials were dispatched across the domain to compile comprehensive inventories of all fixed assets, including houses, land, vineyards, and, most crucially, the contents of the synagogues. This immediate seizure of tangible fixed property transferred immense urban real estate holdings directly to the royal treasury, simultaneously impoverishing the communities and enriching the crown. The expulsion decree did not merely target physical property. It established a novel and far more destructive mechanism for revenue generation: the confiscation of outstanding debts. Philip Augustus recognized that the primary source of communal wealth was tied up in promissory notes and debt registers held against a multitude of Christian debtors, ranging from the nobility to the peasantry. The king declared that a significant portion of this immense portfolio of outstanding debts was now owed directly to the crown, effectively becoming the ultimate beneficiary of years of specialized financial labor. This appropriation eliminated the need for complex, protracted litigation, providing an immediate injection of capital. The 1182 expulsion, therefore, operated as a dual-action policy. It addressed the politically popular demand for religious purification by physically removing the perceived enemies of the faith, while simultaneously functioning as a massive, systematic transfer of wealth and credit infrastructure to the nascent French state. This event provided the definitive legal and operational template for all future, temporary expulsions, solidifying the idea that the Jewish presence was merely conditional upon royal tolerance and fiscal expediency. The expulsion of 1182, while yielding an immediate financial windfall for Philip Augustus, ultimately proved economically short-sighted for the ongoing fiscal requirements of the rapidly expanding Capetian state. The systematic confiscation of debts resulted in a temporary monetary surge, but the removal of the communities eliminated the sustainable long-term flow of revenue generated by recurring taxes and lucrative tallages. Crucially, the absence of the primary source of commercial credit severely hampered the economic activities of the king's remaining Christian subjects. Local lords and urban populations who had relied on Jewish capital for financing were left with a credit vacuum that existing Christian institutions were not yet capable of filling. This immediate fiscal and economic inconvenience led to a reconsideration of the exile policy. In 1198 CE, after a 16-year absence, Philip Augustus executed a pragmatic reversal, issuing an edict that formally permitted the Jewish communities to return to the royal domain. This recall was not motivated by altruism, but by a cold, precise calculation of state finance. The terms of their readmission were meticulously structured to maximize royal revenue and solidify the crown's position as their ultimate sovereign. A central feature of this arrangement was the establishment of a standardized, non-negotiable tax, the droit de gabelle, or tax on every contract. This meant that every single loan, commercial agreement, or transaction involving a Jew, regardless of the amount, instantly generated revenue for the king's treasury, creating a transparent and predictable income stream. Furthermore, the new status ensured that the king retained the legal right to their physical persons and all their assets, codifying them as financial instruments of the crown. This arrangement effectively leased the economic functions of the community back to them in exchange for continuous revenue. The returning communities were often forced to repurchase their former residences and synagogues from the royal officials who had held them since the expulsion, providing a secondary layer of immediate revenue. The relationship established was purely transactional. The king guaranteed protection from local persecution and the right to conduct their essential lending and trading functions, but only in exchange for a mandatory and increasingly onerous financial tribute. This systematic exploitation, formalized through binding royal decree, transformed the Jewish presence from a tolerated minority into a specialized, state-managed fiscal machine. This dependence on the king's precarious financial goodwill became the defining and most dangerous feature of their existence in 13th century France. The reign of Louis IX, canonized as Saint Louis, represented a significant shift in royal policy toward Jewish communities, moving the primary motivation for restriction from pure fiscal exploitation to profound religious orthodoxy. His personal piety, a defining characteristic of his kingship, 1226–1270 CE, mandated the creation of a kingdom whose legal framework aligned rigorously with Christian spiritual doctrines, placing the salvation of the state above immediate financial gain. This conviction translated directly into legislation designed to curb the influence and visibility of non-believers, initiating a new era of intensified legal and social marginalization. Unlike his predecessors who prized the communities for their wealth, Louis IX saw their presence as a theological problem and their financial practices as a moral pollution of the Christian body politic. His policies explicitly targeted the intellectual and ethical life of the communities, a departure from earlier rulers focused mainly on taxation. Louis implemented the widespread prohibition of usury, or interest-bearing loans, by Jewish lenders across his domain. This was a radical measure intended not simply to secure popular favor by eliminating debt, but to enforce a canonical morality onto the secular economy, forcing many communities into fiscal crisis and further reliance on the crown's arbitrary benevolence. While previous kings had occasionally canceled debts, Louis systematically enforced this prohibition, attempting to dismantle the very economic foundation that justified their conditional return. Furthermore, Louis IX rigorously enforced the decrees of the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, which demanded visual differentiation for all Jewish subjects. He was personally responsible for mandating the consistent use of the ruelle, a circular cloth badge to be worn conspicuously on the outer garment of both men and women. This requirement was not just administrative. It was a powerful theological statement, publicly marking the individual as an outsider and facilitating constant surveillance by both civic authorities and the general populace. This institutionalized visible segregation curtailed social mobility and made discrete assimilation virtually impossible, embedding discrimination into the very fabric of daily life. The king also provided extensive patronage for mendicant orders, particularly the Franciscans and Dominicans, whose mission included intense proselytization efforts and the systematic denigration of the Talmud. This royal support for missionary activity contributed to the intellectual warfare that culminated in the public trial of Jewish religious texts, reflecting Louis's overarching goal of achieving the spiritual purification of his realm. The year 1240 CE marks a critical juncture in the intellectual history of French Jewry, witnessing the formal trial and condemnation of the Talmud before the royal court of Louis IX. This judicial event, known as the Disputation of Paris, was not a traditional theological debate seeking mutual understanding. Rather, it was a state-sanctioned inquest into the foundational texts of Rabbinic Judaism, effectively placing the very essence of Jewish intellectual life on the defensive. The catalyst for this unprecedented confrontation was Nicholas Donin, a Jewish convert to Christianity, who presented King Louis with a highly specific list of 35 formal charges against the Talmud. These charges alleged blasphemy, explicit attacks on Christian religious figures, and the propagation of legal and ethical teachings antithetical to the Christian faith. The proceeding took place in the court of the king, granting the outcome immediate, non-negotiable legal force across the realm. The Jewish defense was led by 4 prominent French rabbis, including Rabbi Yehiel of Paris, who were compelled to argue for the sanctity and interpretation of their most sacred post-biblical text before an entirely hostile Christian judicial panel. The primary antagonists were the mendicant scholars, particularly those from the Dominican order, who possessed specialized training in Hebrew and polemics, and who vigorously pressed Donin's accusations. Their strategy focused on literal interpretation of certain agadic, or non-legal, passages taken deliberately out of context to demonstrate their perceived malicious intent. The fundamental legal tension of the disputation lay in the claim by Christian theologians that the existence of the Talmud was an affront to the doctrine of the witness people, arguing that Jewish texts beyond the Old Testament were superfluous and potentially seditious. The rabbinic defense countered by asserting that the disputed passages were not literal dogma but allegorical interpretations or historical comments, and thus irrelevant to the political and social obedience owed to the French crown. This defense was ultimately rejected by the court. Following the conclusion of the proceedings, the commission issued a sweeping judgment. The Talmud was condemned as a repository of errors and malice. This verdict paved the way for the immediate physical destruction of the text, signaling the French monarchy's willingness to move beyond financial persecution to the systematic eradication of the intellectual basis of Jewish communal existence. The judicial verdict, rendered by the 1240 disputation, condemning the Talmud as seditious and heretical, was immediately translated into a brutal, systematic act of cultural eradication orchestrated by the royal government. The execution of the judgment occurred in June 1242 CE, when a vast collection of confiscated religious manuscripts was publicly incinerated in Paris. The site chosen for this unparalleled act of intellectual destruction was the Place de Grève, a prominent civic square traditionally reserved for public executions and official announcements, thereby lending the condemnation maximum symbolic and political gravity. This deliberate staging framed the burning not merely as a scholarly censure, but as a necessary purification of the realm, sanctioned by the highest secular authority. The scale of the destruction was immense and represented an irreparable loss to Jewish scholarship. Royal officials, acting on warrants issued immediately after the trial, had forcibly seized every available copy of the Talmud and associated commentaries from synagogues and private homes across the Capetian domain and adjacent territories. Estimates preserved in contemporary accounts suggest that the total number of volumes destroyed exceeded 12,000, a figure that includes not only the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds, but also the works of the Tosafists and other foundational legal and exegetical texts. This quantity underscores the depth of scholarly activity that had flourished in northern France and the thoroughness of the royal inventory and confiscation process. The material loss had devastating and lasting consequences for the continuity of Franco-Jewish intellectual tradition. Unlike financial levies, which could be replenished through commercial activity, the knowledge contained within those handwritten codices, the culmination of centuries of rabbinic law, tradition, and scholarly debate, was irreplaceable. The systematic destruction effectively severed the direct, immediate connection of the French academies to their intellectual past. Scholars who survived the purge were forced to rely on memory, fragmentary notes, and the few copies that had been successfully smuggled or hidden from royal inquisitors, making further intellectual advancement and the precise preservation of legal rulings immensely difficult. This systematic destruction served as the most unambiguous statement yet of the monarchy's ultimate goal: to dismantle the spiritual and intellectual infrastructure of the Jewish presence. It demonstrated that the French crown, under Louis IX, was willing to prioritize theological conformity and the eradication of perceived spiritual threats over the short-term financial advantages provided by Jewish subjects. The trauma of the event was etched into communal memory, commemorated subsequently by special fast days, and forever altered the relationship between the Jewish population and the medieval book in Europe. The mandatory imposition of a distinguishing garment mark represented a systematic effort to enforce the definitive separation of Jewish subjects from the Christian majority within the French realm. This policy originated from the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 CE, a major assembly of ecclesiastical authorities which issued sweeping decrees regulating the relationship between different faith groups. The conciliar decree stipulated that Jews and Saracens residing in Christian lands must wear a visible sign to prevent shameful intercourse between different populations. King Louis IX, driven by his deep religious conviction and commitment to canonical law, was instrumental in enforcing this measure with unyielding administrative rigor across his domain. The specific insignia adopted in France was the ruelle, a small piece of fabric, typically circular in shape, and colored saffron or yellow, which was required to be sewn conspicuously onto the outer clothing of both adult men and women. The diameter and placement of the ruelle were often specified in exacting detail by local royal ordinances, ensuring its maximum visibility in public spaces. Failure to wear the sign, or attempts to conceal it, were met with escalating fines, public humiliation, and ultimately, imprisonment, transforming a minor sartorial oversight into a serious act of defiance against royal and ecclesiastical authority. The function of the ruelle was multifaceted, serving immediate administrative and deeper theological purposes. Administratively, the badge streamlined the process of identification for royal tax collectors and local bailiffs, facilitating the collection of special taxes and fees applied exclusively to the Jewish population. This constant, immediate identification was essential to the Servi Camera Regis principle, ensuring that the king's property could be monitored and accounted for at all times. Theologically, the badge served as a permanent, public symbol of the population's perpetual outsider status and their perceived rejection of the Christian truth. It constituted a continuous form of public humiliation designed to break down self-esteem and encourage conversion, while simultaneously minimizing social interaction with the Christian populace. This visual marking effectively institutionalized social marginalization, transforming every public encounter into a stark reminder of the individual's distinct and subordinate legal status. It rendered physical assimilation or blending into the general urban crowd impossible, permanently altering the dynamics of daily life. The implementation of this decree secured the compliance of subsequent Capetian rulers, establishing the visible badge as a mandatory condition of Jewish residence in France until the final expulsions were executed. The ruelle thus stands as a crucial legislative precursor, perfecting the means of identifying and isolating the population targeted for later financial and demographic removal. The evolving legal and social framework of high medieval France systematically channeled Jewish communities away from their traditional commercial diversity toward a near-exclusive dependence on monetary finance. This specialization was not a voluntary preference, but a consequence of escalating, legally enforced constraints on other forms of economic activity. As early as the 12th century, a series of secular and ecclesiastical decrees severely curtailed Jewish participation in the lucrative trades that had defined the preceding eras, specifically prohibiting them from engaging in agriculture, owning land, and holding certain public offices. These restrictions, often justified by theological arguments concerning the necessity of Jewish humiliation, were highly effective in dismantling the broad-based commercial infrastructure previously enjoyed. The definitive legal pressure point remained the canonical prohibition on Christian lending at interest, or usury. Since the Church strictly forbade its adherents from charging interest on loans, a critical and unfulfilled demand for credit existed throughout the French economy, from the highest noble houses to the most indebted peasantry. This prohibition created a mandatory economic niche that Jewish lenders were uniquely positioned to fill. Operating outside the constraints of canonical law, they could provide the essential risk capital necessary for seasonal agricultural cycles, artisan production, and the occasional funding of chivalric expeditions. This function was tolerated and indeed protected by the crown, precisely because it was financially necessary yet ethically forbidden to the Christian majority. The nature of this lending was predominantly characterized by short-term, high-risk, pawn-based transactions, rather than the long-term, low-interest commercial banking provided by emerging Italian houses. Jewish lenders often maintained small establishments, managing loan books backed by physical collateral such as jewelry, household goods, or tools, reflecting the immediate, modest needs of their clientele. This economic specialization, while securing a continuous, albeit precarious, existence for the communities, simultaneously exacerbated the social hostility directed against them. The collection of interest, irrespective of the genuine economic necessity it served, provided the perpetual moral justification for debt cancellation, arbitrary fines, and, ultimately, the final, total expropriation of assets by the monarchy. The reliance on this single economic activity transformed the communities into highly visible and easily calculable reservoirs of liquid wealth, making them an ideal, accessible target for the Capetian monarch's recurrent, desperate fiscal needs. This shift ensured that their economic destiny was entirely contingent upon the monarchy's tolerance of usury as a mechanism for indirect state finance. The accession of Philip IV, known historically as Philip the Fair, reigned 1285–1314 CE, coincided with the mature development of the French administrative state, a highly specialized, centralized bureaucracy essential for governing an expanding and financially demanding kingdom. Philip's ambitious, perpetual need for massive, immediate revenue streams drove the refinement of this administrative apparatus, transforming it into a highly efficient instrument of fiscal coercion and legal manipulation. His government relied heavily on a new class of educated, non-noble officials, legists who specialized in Roman law, and the expansion of royal prerogative, asserting the king's sovereignty over all persons and property within the realm. This intellectual foundation provided the legal justification for actions previously deemed too radical or politically impossible. The structure of this state machine was hierarchical and precise. The Chambre des Comptes, Chamber of Accounts, evolved into a professional auditing and financial control body capable of meticulous record-keeping, essential for tracking complex revenue sources and managing expropriated assets. At the local level, a network of bailiffs, bailists, and seneschals, seneschaux, appointed and paid directly by the crown, exercised judicial and fiscal authority. These officials were instrumental in the direct enforcement of royal decrees, bypassing the historically unreliable feudal network and guaranteeing a uniform, nationwide application of the king's will. This centralization was the prerequisite for the coordinated, simultaneous execution of mass arrests and total asset seizures across the vast territory. The bureaucratic apparatus's capability for unprecedented logistical feats was demonstrated by its systematic targeting of financial institutions and corporate bodies. The most notable precursor to the 1306 expulsion was the 1303 seizure of assets from Italian bankers, and, most dramatically, the systematic coordinated dismantling of the wealthy and politically protected Knights Templar in 1307. The Templar operation, planned in absolute secrecy and executed simultaneously across the entire kingdom on a single day, demonstrated the state's supreme capacity for surprise, coordination, and the systematic inventory of complex financial holdings. The success of these massive national seizures provided the definitive operational blueprint, the template of command structure, security protocols, and documentation requirements that would be directly applied to the Jewish communities. The emergence of this powerful secular state apparatus under Philip the Fair fundamentally shifted the power dynamic, rendering organized resistance or even effective evasion impossible for any group designated as a target for royal revenue generation. The aggressive foreign policy pursued by Philip the Fair, particularly his persistent and costly military engagements in Flanders, created an acute and sustained financial crisis for the French monarchy that necessitated radical fiscal remedies. The wealthy semi-autonomous counties of Flanders, with their flourishing cloth production centers, represented a crucial strategic and economic prize for the Capetian crown. However, securing control over these territories, which required continuous campaigns against defiant burghers and organized local militias, proved far more expensive and protracted than initially anticipated. Battles such as the catastrophic defeat at Courtrai in 1302, where French heavy cavalry was routed by Flemish infantry, demanded immediate and immense reinvestment in military resources, straining the royal treasury to its breaking point. Traditional sources of royal income, such as feudal aids and the customary land taxes, were simply insufficient to cover the escalating expenses of maintaining professional armies, purchasing siege equipment, and funding prolonged campaigns. In response, Philip IV's sophisticated financial bureaucracy engaged in highly controversial practices, including the systematic debasement of the currency, reducing the precious metal content of coins to generate nominal profit. This measure, however, led to widespread inflation, economic instability, and significant public discontent, proving to be a fiscally dangerous, short-term solution. The Crown, therefore, urgently needed reliable, one-time infusions of liquid capital that could be extracted quickly and justified politically. This intense pressure made any corporate body known to possess liquid assets an immediate and tempting target for royal appropriation. The Jewish communities, characterized by their easily quantifiable and accessible wealth tied up in chattel and loan books, represented the most expedient solution to this liquidity crisis. Unlike the slow process of raising taxes from landed estates, the expropriation of Jewish assets offered the promise of immediate gold and silver reserves necessary to cover military pay and logistical requirements. The Crown's legists systematically leveraged the existing legal concept of servitus judiciorum, the Jews' status as direct royal property, to frame the expulsion not as theft, but as the monarch legitimately reclaiming his own assets to secure the defense of the realm. This justification, combining military necessity with legal precedent, provided the moral and political cover for the extraordinary act of seizing all communal assets, a move deemed essential to sustaining the state's military agenda in the face of overwhelming and relentless financial strain. The destruction of the Knights Templar between 1307 and 1312 CE represented a monumental assertion of royal power and a crucial dress rehearsal for the later systematic expropriation of the Jewish community. As a military religious order founded during the Crusades, the Templars had evolved into the foremost international banking and financial institution in Europe, managing immense wealth derived from European donations, vast landholdings, and their sophisticated system of transferring funds for pilgrims and monarchs alike. By the early 14th century, the Templar treasury served as a de facto central bank for the French crown, often acting as a lender of last resort. This concentration of liquid mobile wealth made the order an irresistible target for Philip the Fair, whose treasury was perpetually strained by expensive military campaigns and currency manipulation schemes. The operation against the Templars commenced on Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, when royal agents, acting on sealed orders, executed simultaneous arrests of the order's members across the entirety of the French kingdom. This event demonstrated the unprecedented logistical reach and efficiency of Philip IV's centralized bureaucracy, proving its capability to act with surprise and uniformity on a national scale against a highly organized corporate body. The charges leveled against the order were theological blasphemy, heresy, and sodomy, rather than fiscal, providing the necessary moral and religious pretext to justify the seizure of a revered organization. The use of systematic torture, sanctioned by the king's legists, secured the required confessions that provided the legal grounds for the order's final dissolution by Pope Clement V in 1312. The Templar action established two critical precedents directly applicable to the Jewish communities. First, it confirmed the king's absolute power to seize the entire corporate wealth of any group within his jurisdiction, under the pretense of religious or moral offense, regardless of their international connections or traditional protective status. Second, the operation provided the Capetian administration with invaluable experience in the forensic accounting necessary to inventory and assume complex financial assets, including loan portfolios, debt instruments, and hoards of specie. The administrative protocols, refined during the dismantling of the Templars, the swift, synchronized arrests, the detailed cataloging of assets, and the reliance on coerced judicial findings, were precisely the operational models deployed later against the Jewish population. The destruction of the Templars thus cleared the financial field, eliminating the most powerful potential competitor for credit provision and confirming the Jewish communities as the next, and most accessible, remaining source of ready wealth for the financially distressed French state. The eventual expulsion of 1306 CE was not an impulsive or sudden act of mob violence, but the culmination of meticulous, long-term administrative planning under the direction of Philip the Fair's highly efficient fiscal bureaucracy. The logic of seizure dictated that a nationwide operation of this scale required absolute precision in documentation and command structure to maximize the financial return for the crown. The core of these preparations involved a detailed, systematic assessment of the community's collective wealth, which, since the royal recall of 1198, was considered property held in trust for the monarchy. This inventory phase was crucial for predetermining the expected yield of the expulsion. Key financial officials, particularly the maîtres des comptes, masters of accounts, and specialized financial clerks, were dispatched to regions with significant Jewish populations, to audit loan registers and estimate the value of movable property. These officials did not merely count assets. They created precise, standardized forms and account books designed to track every seized item and outstanding debt upon execution. The goal was to eliminate the possibility of local administrators diverting confiscated funds or property into their own feudal coffers, ensuring that the entire revenue stream flowed directly into the treasury. The administrative precedent set by the earlier systematic dismantling of the Templar order provided the exact operational blueprint for this forensic accounting task. Furthermore, the legal justification for the action was prepared in advance by the king's legists. The Edict of Expulsion, sealed and kept secret until the day of execution, formally declared that the Jewish subjects had forfeited their right to royal protection through unspecified offenses, thereby giving the king legitimate cause to reclaim his property. This declaration transformed the act of removal and confiscation from a simple punitive measure into a high-level judicial and fiscal procedure. The preparatory phase also included the organization of necessary physical security. Local bailiffs and seneschals were covertly instructed to ready their armed retinues, ensuring that when the secret command was issued, the physical removal and subsequent arrests could be carried out immediately and simultaneously across the diverse geography of the French realm. This administrative foresight, involving detailed assessment, legal pretense, and logistical preparation, guaranteed the operational success of the expulsion as a systematic, state-controlled revenue-generating exercise. The actual execution of the 1,306 expulsion hinged entirely on the absolute secrecy and synchronized dissemination of the royal command. The operational goal was to achieve simultaneous arrests across the geographically vast and diverse French realm on a single predetermined date, thereby preventing forewarning, flight, and the consequent concealment or liquidation of assets. This required a highly controlled, cascading chain of command emanating directly from the king's inner council. The decree itself, the lettre de cachet, was meticulously prepared and bore the royal seal, lending it unquestionable authority across all jurisdictions. The primary conduits for the mandate were the king's professional administrators, the bailies in the north and the seneschaux in the south. These officials, who governed large territories on behalf of the crown, were summoned to regional rendezvous points under vague, non-specific pretexts related to general fiscal or military mobilization. At these secret meetings, each administrator received a sealed envelope containing the royal mandate. Crucially, strict and explicit instructions were included, commanding that the seal remain unbroken until a specified, imminent date and time, ensuring that the critical information was unveiled simultaneously across dozens of different locations. This protocol was designed to neutralize any leaks or deliberate sabotage by local officials sympathetic to the communities or motivated by the chance of personal profit before the official royal seizure. The timing chosen for the coordinated action was a Friday, coinciding with the Jewish Sabbath, a day when communities were traditionally gathered in prayer and less likely to be engaged in external commercial activities or travel. This tactical consideration maximized the element of surprise and minimized the possibility of widespread communal resistance or mass escape during the brief time window afforded for flight. The bailiffs and seneschals were explicitly instructed to use their official armed retinues, the local mounted military forces, to enforce the order, effectively transforming the royal administration into an occupying army for the purposes of the operation. This deployment ensured the immediate physical security of the arrested populace and secured the various points of communal wealth, notably the loan registries and strongboxes within the juveries. The logistical precision and secrecy demonstrated in the dissemination of these sealed mandates confirmed the unparalleled efficiency of Philip the Fair's centralized governance, successfully translating a purely financial objective into a rapid, nationwide administrative and physical operation. The morning of Friday, the 22nd of July 1306 CE, witnessed the immediate, synchronized operational phase of the expulsion decree across the entirety of the French royal domain. This date, chosen for tactical reasons that maximize surprise, saw the simultaneous unsealing and execution of the royal mandates delivered covertly to the local authorities. The swiftness and uniformity of the action were critical, reflecting the strategic planning necessary to target a population estimated at nearly 100,000 individuals residing in dozens of disparate urban and rural communities. The operation was managed by the king's professional administrative corps, primarily the bailli and seneschaux, who deployed their official armed contingents to ensure full compliance. Upon the hour specified in the sealed writs, the royal officers converged on the Juveries and the known residences of Jewish families. The initial phase focused exclusively on detaining every individual, irrespective of age, gender, or social status. The use of armed retinues, local military forces immediately neutralized any possibility of widespread resistance or organized flight, effectively transforming the arrest into a swift, nonviolent occupation of the communities. The simultaneous arrests were crucial to preserving the community's assets, preventing the immediate liquidation or concealment of portable wealth, which was the primary fiscal goal of the crown. The element of surprise was complete, allowing the king's agents to secure the persons of the inhabitants before they could react to the official proclamation. Following the initial detention, the royal officers immediately secured all communal institutions, including synagogues and private residences, placing them under the direct custody of the crown. Specialized clerks and financial agents, who had been deployed alongside the arresting forces, commenced the laborious process of inventory and documentation. Their immediate priority was locating and securing the financial records, the strong boxes containing specie, precious metals, and, most importantly, the extensive registers of outstanding loan accounts. The individuals themselves were given a negligible grace period, just a few days, to prepare for their mandatory departure from the kingdom. They were permitted to take only the clothing they wore and a minimal sum of money, specified by royal decree, intended to cover immediate subsistence needs for their impending exile. This maximum limit was strictly enforced by the accompanying royal escorts, ensuring that the bulk of the community's liquid resources remained fully under royal control. The systematic nature of the detention and the subsequent restrictions on movement confirmed the unparalleled efficiency of the centralized French state in executing a complex, nationwide demographic and fiscal policy. Immediately following the detention of the Jewish population on the 22nd of July 1306, the Crown's administrative machinery commenced the rigorous, centralized process of asset valuation and inventory. This phase, termed the Inventory of Lives, constituted the financial heart of the expulsion, ensuring that the maximum quantifiable wealth was systematically transferred to the king's treasury. The operation was managed by specialized teams of clerks, notaries, and financial agents, who arrived with pre-printed forms and account books designed for standardized documentation across all royal territories. The objective was the forensic accounting of every financial instrument and tangible possession. The inventory process distinguished meticulously between fixed assets, movable property, and credit instruments. Fixed assets, such as houses, courtyards, workshops, and gardens, were secured and their boundaries measured and recorded, establishing the legal claim for their immediate escheat to the royal domain. Movable property required detailed itemization. This included personal jewelry, garments, silver and gold plate, and essential household items like furnishings and kitchenware. Even objects of modest intrinsic value were catalogued, underscoring the thoroughness of the royal agents in leaving no source of revenue untaxed or unsecured. The financial clerks had specific expertise in appraising these diverse items to determine their market value prior to the subsequent royal auctions. The highest priority, however, remained the systematic recording of the loan portfolios. Financial agents seized the cahiers de dette, the detailed registers of outstanding loans from every known moneylender. These books were meticulously copied and verified by notaries and crown officials to establish the precise names of the debtors, the principal owed, and the accompanying interest terms. This painstaking documentation was essential because the crown was legally transforming itself into the universal creditor, substituting the king for the Jewish lender in thousands of individual financial transactions. The sheer volume of this credit transfer made it the single largest prospective fiscal gain from the entire operation. The meticulous nature of the record-keeping extended to communal property, detailing the contents of synagogues, bathhouses, mikvehs, and cemetery lands before their eventual public sale. This exhaustive inventory, surviving in fragmentary administrative records, provides a unique, though tragic, snapshot of the economic and material life of the Franco-Jewish communities at the moment of their destruction. The administrative dedication to this immense national accounting exercise confirms the king's primary motivation: to execute the most profitable possible fiscal seizure under the guise of religious necessity. The pivotal financial maneuver of the 1306 expulsion was the systematic transfer of the entire Jewish loan portfolio directly to the French crown. This action, the legal appropriation of all outstanding debts, was the strategic objective that guaranteed the fiscal success of the operation. The monarchy's legal experts had meticulously prepared the doctrine, arguing that since the Jewish lenders and all their assets belonged to the king under the principle of servi cameri regis, any obligation owed to them was ipso facto owed to the royal treasury. This doctrine transformed Philip the Fair from a sovereign protector into the single, universal creditor for thousands of Christian debtors across his kingdom. The execution of this transfer relied heavily on the cahiers des dettes, the detailed loan registers seized during the arrests, which contained the precise legal and financial terms of every contract. The meticulous copying and verification of these ledgers by notaries and crown officials established the legal basis for the king's claim. Once secured, these registers were transported to the Chambre des Comptes for centralized management. The subsequent collection of these debts, however, proved to be a highly complex and geographically fragmented administrative challenge, far exceeding the initial difficulty of the seizure. The king immediately faced the politically and practically difficult task of collecting funds from a diverse population of debtors, many of whom were nobles who previously enjoyed the privilege of non-repayment, or peasants who lacked immediate liquidity. To manage this, the crown sold significant portions of the debt portfolio to Christian financiers and urban corporations, effectively privatizing the collection process to yield a faster, though often discounted, return. These purchasers acquired the legal right, backed by royal authority, to pursue the collection of the principal owed, thereby transferring the burden and the potential unpopularity of debt collection away from the monarchy. This mechanism was a pragmatic acknowledgement that the decentralized network of collection built by the Jewish communities could not be easily replicated by the centralized state. Despite this partial sale, the remaining uncollected debts still represented an enormous, if slow-moving financial asset for the crown, requiring years of sustained administrative effort to realize its full value. This systematic confiscation was the core difference between the 1306 expulsion and earlier, less profitable removals. It targeted the abstract wealth of credit, not just tangible property. By transforming the status of the Jewish community, Philip IV utilized legal fiction to perform the largest governmental leveraged buyout of private financial assets in medieval history, securing a unique source of revenue essential for funding the state's incessant military needs. The brief grace period granted to the Jewish population following the arrests expired quickly, initiating the mandatory, immediate process of physical removal from the French kingdom. This phase, involving an estimated 100,000 individuals, presented a logistical challenge of enormous proportions for both the expelled and the royal administration overseeing the exodus. The French state, having meticulously secured the assets, now concerned itself with ensuring that the maximum number of people departed quickly and peaceably toward designated external borders. The routes chosen for exile were dictated by geography and the political viability of receiving territories. Primarily the county of Provence, the principalities of the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, via the Rhine Valley, and the various kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. The actual movement of these masses was managed by officially appointed royal escorts, military detachments whose function was dual: to protect the king's remaining property, the small sum of cash and the clothing permitted to each exile, and to prevent the return or unauthorized settlement within the domain's boundaries. The constraints imposed on the exiles were harsh and unyielding. They were only allowed to carry portable objects that could be physically borne on foot, forcing the abandonment of essential tools, furniture, and all non-liquid investments. This deliberate imposition of hardship maximized the number of assets left behind for the crown's benefit. The exodus itself was characterized by fragmentation and dispersal. Families and former neighbors, uprooted from urban centers, were forced onto poorly maintained medieval roads, often traveling through territories that had only recently been brought under royal control. The security provided by the royal escorts was minimal and often unreliable, especially near the border regions where authority was diffuse and opportunities for criminal exploitation of the vulnerable exiles were rife. The high costs associated with travel, compounded by the severely limited cash reserves permitted for the journey, quickly depleted the remaining funds, turning the exile into a desperate search for immediate subsistence and potable water. The political realities of the receiving lands dictated the final destinations. Southern communities generally moved toward the relatively tolerant territories of Provence and Aragon. Northern communities migrated toward the German lands, already scarred by earlier Crusader violence. The mass movement of these experienced merchants and lenders introduced a sudden, profound influx of financial and intellectual talent into the neighboring regions, inadvertently strengthening the economies of the competing polities. The sheer scale and speed of this enforced demographic shift underscored the Capetian regime's power, successfully expelling an entire corporate body and transferring the problem of its survival onto foreign jurisdictions. The rapid and comprehensive removal of the Jewish population in July 1306 immediately created a quantifiable demographic vacuum within the major urban centers of the royal domain. This massive, involuntary exodus, involving a significant proportion of the kingdom's specialized financial and educated workforce, resulted in pronounced negative repercussions on local economic stability. The merchant class, with its unique international connections and expertise in high-value, long-distance trade, was instantly eliminated. This loss shattered the existing infrastructure for commercial exchange that relied on Jewish multilingualism and their established kinship networks stretching across Europe and the Mediterranean. The effect was an immediate contraction in the flow of luxury goods, spices, and high-quality textiles into the French markets, disrupting the supply chains essential to the aristocracy and wealthy burghers. The financial sector experienced the most acute shock. The removal of the communities instantly eliminated the primary source of small-scale, readily available credit and liquid capital. Christian competitors, primarily the developing Lombard and Italian banking houses, were large institutions focused on high-volume, long-term state and papal finance. They lacked the infrastructure, motivation, or legal freedom to provide the essential quick turnaround loans previously offered by the Jewish pawnbrokers. The absence of this localized credit mechanism severely hampered the daily economic activities of small artisans, local traders, and peasant farmers who relied on short-term cash infusions for working capital or seed purchases. This sudden credit freeze negatively affected local productivity and hindered commerce at the regional level. Intellectually, the expulsion resulted in the near-total obliteration of the scholarly class that had defined northern French Jewry for centuries. The intellectual centers of Sarfat, once home to the seminal works of Rashi and the Tosafists, were instantly depopulated of their scholars, physicians, and rabbinic judges. The institutional knowledge contained within the community's courts, hospitals, and educational academies was irrevocably lost to the kingdom. This demographic cleansing created a void in the transmission of specialized secular knowledge, particularly in areas like medicine and astronomy, where Jewish scholars had long excelled as intermediaries. The French crown, while achieving its immediate fiscal objective through asset seizure, inadvertently crippled the functioning of local credit and deprived its urban centers of a specialized, productive demographic layer, creating a persistent economic and intellectual deficit that subsequent attempts to fill proved challenging and protracted. Following the physical removal of the population and the meticulous inventory of their wealth, the final stage of the royal expropriation involved the liquidation of the community's substantial fixed assets. This process, spanning many months after the July arrests, required the systematic auctioning of valuable urban real estate and communal, consecrated properties to the local Christian populace. The primary goal of the Crown's financial agents was to convert the physical, immobile heritage of the Jewries into fungible gold and silver specie that could be transferred directly into the royal treasury, financing the king's military endeavors. The administrative task was complex necessitating the public valuation and sale of thousands of properties across numerous towns where Jewish settlements were established. Royal officials, often the same bailies who conducted the arrests, organized open auctions in the public squares. These sales were typically poorly attended initially, as the local population was often wary of acquiring property recently confiscated under dubious legal pretense. Consequently, the Crown was frequently compelled to sell the properties at depressed prices to municipal authorities, wealthy burghers, or powerful ecclesiastical institutions who were better equipped to absorb the political risk and legal ambiguity associated with the acquisitions. Crucially, the liquidation included the sacred communal properties whose value derived from their religious function. Synagogues, once the centers of rabbinic authority and scholarship, were sold and frequently converted immediately for Christian worship, often being dedicated as chapels or parish churches, ensuring the physical eradication of the former faith's presence. Communal bathhouses, or mikvehs, were often filled in or adapted for secular use, their specialized function eliminated entirely. Even the cemeteries, consecrated grounds that held the remains of generations, were sold off, the land often repurposed for agricultural plots or quarrying, with the headstones sometimes incorporated into new Christian buildings. This systematic liquidation of fixed assets yielded a significant, though ultimately finite, revenue stream for Philip the Fair. Beyond the financial returns, the auctioning served a definitive political and theological purpose. By transferring physical ownership of all communal, residential, and sacred spaces to Christian hands, the Crown ensured the absolute finality of the expulsion. The physical foundations of Jewish corporate existence in France were irrevocably dismantled, transforming the former Jewveries from functioning neighborhoods into a mere administrative memory of royal revenue generation. This material destruction ensured that any subsequent temporary return of Jewish people would require starting anew without the institutional, physical roots necessary for long-term communal stability. The immediate fiscal euphoria accompanying the seizure of Jewish assets quickly gave way to the sobering reality of administrative and economic complexity. While the arrests secured a vast quantity of gold, silver, and pawned collateral in the short term, the subsequent prolonged processes of liquidation and debt collection proved far less profitable than Philip the Fair's legists had initially projected. The sheer volume of foreclosed urban real estate and scattered movable goods required time-consuming public auctions, and the necessity of immediate cash flow often compelled the Crown to sell these properties at steep discounts to secure rapid bids from municipal authorities and powerful nobles. The anticipated market value of the confiscated property was never fully realized due to the compressed timetable and the inherent reluctance of the public to purchase assets acquired through mass state seizure. The largest operational hurdle, however, was the collection of the enormous portfolio of outstanding loan debts. The state's centralized bureaucracy was ill-equipped to manage the granular, localized, and often coercive business of debt collection that the Jewish lenders had conducted through personalized, intimate networks. The royal administration lacked the necessary regional contacts and local knowledge to pursue thousands of small, scattered debts from the peasantry and minor nobles. Furthermore, many debtors actively resisted payment, leveraging the unpopularity of the expulsion to evade their financial obligations, forcing the Crown into costly and protracted legal conflicts to enforce its new creditor status. The costs associated with deploying officials, maintaining regional collection offices, and managing the inevitable judicial disputes significantly eroded the net profit margin derived from the debt seizure. More critically, the expulsion eliminated the entire future revenue stream that had sustained the monarchy for decades. The regular, reliable income generated by the annual tallages, the contract taxes, droit de gabelle, and other special levies levied on the Jewish communities ceased instantaneously. The subsequent loss of this consistent, institutionalized source of royal finance eventually outweighed the one-time, albeit large, influx of capital from the 1306 seizure. The severe credit vacuum created by the removal of the specialized lenders also exacerbated the kingdom's existing economic instability, undermining the very base from which future royal taxes would be collected. The Chambre des Comptes records subsequently revealed the disappointing net yield, demonstrating that the administrative overhead and the elimination of a predictable tax base rendered the expulsion an ultimately short-sighted fiscal policy. This pragmatic failure motivated later French monarchs to attempt the recall of the communities in subsequent decades, driven entirely by the realization that a living, taxed Jewish community was far more profitable than one that had been financially extinguished. The physical aftermath of the 1,306 expulsion left an immediate, observable architectural void in the urban centers of the French kingdom. The swift departure of the Jewish communities and the subsequent systematic liquidation of their assets resulted in the complete transformation of the Jewevries from functional, concentrated neighborhoods into abandoned royal property. Archaeological investigation, often utilizing modern urban excavations, has provided fragmentary but compelling evidence of this immediate post-expulsion period, documenting the abrupt cessation of occupation and the rapid repurposing of the former quarters. The layers of soil immediately post-1306 show a sudden drop in specific artifact types related to Jewish domestic life, such as specialized ceramics or liturgical items, confirming the instant demographic change. The most tangible evidence of the destruction lies in the fate of the communal structures. Following the public auctions, the vacated synagogues and bathhouses, often built with high-quality cut stone, were immediately stripped of their religious identity. The new Christian owners, whether municipal corporations or private individuals, frequently dismantled sections of the buildings for their constituent raw materials. This process of spoliation led to the widespread reuse of sacred Jewish stone for secular construction projects. Foundation stones, carefully dressed blocks, and even sections of decorative architectural elements were often incorporated into the walls of new houses, bridges, or, most tellingly, into the fortifications and defensive towers of the urban centers. This act was pragmatic, utilizing readily available building materials, but also symbolically asserted Christian dominion over the previously distinct space. The former residential areas often underwent a period of neglect before being reoccupied. Property lines were occasionally redrawn, and alleyways were altered or closed off, effectively erasing the original pattern of the quarter. Where Christian families moved in, evidence of the prior residence was often systematically removed to eliminate any ambiguity regarding the new ownership and religious use. This physical erasure was particularly evident on the cemetery grounds, which, once sold, were often converted to gardens or agricultural use, with grave markers being the first objects to be destroyed or repurposed as paving stones and building blocks. The archaeological record thus confirms the finality of the expulsion beyond the written royal decrees. It illustrates not only the abrupt end of a cultural presence, but also the physical mechanism of assimilation and destruction. The remnants of Jewish sacred architecture, embedded and obscured within Christian fortifications, serve as a mute but powerful testimony to the systematic efforts by the French crown and local authorities to financially exploit and physically eradicate the material traces of the expelled communities. The immediate consequence of the mass exodus from the French kingdom in 1306 was the sudden, involuntary establishment of extensive refugee networks in neighboring politically distinct territories. The primary destinations for this influx of nearly 100,000 exiles included the kingdoms of Aragon and Navarre in Iberia, the county of Provence at that time, subject to the King of Naples, and the various principalities along the Rhine River in the fragmented Holy Roman Empire. The arrival of such a large, specialized, and highly educated population group created both immense logistical challenges for the host governments and a critical injection of economic and intellectual capital. In the receiving territories, the former residents of France, known collectively as Zarfatim, French Jews, sought to recreate the institutional structures essential for communal survival. They established temporary quarters, initially relying on the hospitality and financial aid provided by the established Jewish communities in these new lands. The immediate priority was the establishment of functioning religious and judicial infrastructure, including new synagogues and courts capable of rendering legal decisions according to rabbinic law. This process required formal recognition from the local counts, dukes, or monarchs, necessitating the negotiation of new charters that defined their rights of residence, taxation, and economic engagement. A critical aspect of this forced migration was the preservation of a distinct cultural identity, often termed the Zarfatic tradition. Despite the geographic dispersal, the exiles maintained the unique scholarly methodologies and legal interpretations developed in the schools of northern France, particularly the legacy of the Tosophists. They founded new academies in cities like Barcelona and Avignon, ensuring the continuity of their complex system of Talmudic analysis. Furthermore, they brought with them specific French liturgical traditions and, crucially, maintained the use of Old French in their vernacular writing and some internal communications, using Hebrew characters to transcribe the language. This linguistic and scholarly retention functioned as a powerful unifying marker of their former home. The economic adaptation of the exiles was complex. While many continued their financial vocations, they faced stiff competition from existing local lenders and the powerful Italian banking institutions already present in the new regions. Their high skill level and mobility, however, allowed them to integrate quickly into the new economic environments, often reviving or expanding regional trade routes. This massive influx of financial expertise and commercial contacts demonstrated that the expulsion, while intended to solve the French crown's fiscal deficit, ultimately served to bolster the economic vitality of its rivals, providing them with a substantial demographic advantage in the financial and intellectual sphere. The expulsion of 1306 CE did not merely constitute a temporary demographic displacement. It marked the structural, definitive conclusion of the historical Jewish presence in northern France, a vibrant civilization that had flourished continuously for over 1,000 years since the Roman period. The action taken by Philip the Fair was final in its immediate economic and intellectual consequences, fundamentally severing the institutional continuity of French Jewry. By systematically dismantling the physical infrastructure, the synagogues, homes, and communal bathhouses, and by liquidating the entire financial asset base, the Crown ensured that no surviving community could spontaneously regenerate its corporate identity within the royal domain. The expulsion was an act of complete institutional termination, not merely an inconvenient temporary eviction. Although subsequent Capetian and Valois monarchs would attempt limited temporary recalls of the Jewish population, these returns were driven solely by short-term fiscal desperation and were always conducted under stricter, more precarious financial charters. These later communities never managed to achieve the stability, size, or intellectual prominence of their pre-1306 predecessors. They lacked the centuries of inherited communal property, the sophisticated network of established loan registers, and the critical mass of distinguished scholars required to re-establish the centers of learning that had defined Zarfat. These brief, conditional returns were consistently followed by subsequent expulsions, notably in 1322 and 1394, reinforcing the instability and ultimately proving the permanent vulnerability of the French Jewish existence. The lasting legacy of the 1306 Act was the creation of a profound void in French society and history. The intellectual tradition of the Tosophists became the exclusive inheritance of the exile communities, whose scholars carried the methodologies into Spain, Italy, and the German lands, geographically transferring France's scholarly heritage to rival polities. Within France itself, the memory of the communities was reduced to the physical remnants of the ruined Juveries and the vast, uncollectible debt books now managed by the royal treasury. The state, having achieved its goal of fiscal extraction and demographic purification, effectively ensured that the Jewish civilization that had developed its own distinctive customs, liturgy, and scholarly school on French soil for a millennium ceased to exist as an organized, legal entity within the kingdom.